albums on Spotify that I can find that remind me of Christmases of the past, Christmases growing up. What Christmas songs or artists do you turn to in this time of the year? Choosing the albums to be playing as we decorate the tree, it's a special responsibility. You gotta have the music in the background. Whatever we believe about Christmas, and I have some pretty firm beliefs about that, as do many of you, tradition also plays a part, an important part of these days and of these times to celebrate. That tradition, those memories that you have that are part of that tradition, they can warm your heart. They can also, though, cause a lot of pain. Because those traditions are inevitably tied to people. People that perhaps you can celebrate with once again this year, or people that perhaps you have said goodbye to as they've passed away or they're maybe even estranged. Christmas can be a time of great joy and a time of great pain. With all the Christmas songs playing, it really amazes me every year to hear musical artists who live lives that are openly outside of God's way of life, to hear them sing biblically solid songs during Christmas. Do you ever think about that, just the irony or the sadness as it takes place? There's some wonderful truths in some of the most popular Christmas songs. And so many sing those rich songs not even realizing the importance of those words. You could say in a technical sense that these people know the truth, but there's no connection between the words they sing and their hearts. At least there's not the connection of faith. That they might love the songs, well, that's possible because some people love that kind of tradition. I make no claim to know which singers have true faith, or only recognize that some who sing very different songs the rest of the year are more than willing to sing biblically some rich songs during this time. Tradition is an interesting thing. It's a powerful thing, but it's not a saving thing. For the last 2 weeks, we've considered Jesus the coming king. He will rule the earth one day. The Bible clearly teaches that. He's already lived on this earth. He will establish his kingdom one day in the future and reign on the earth. His reign will be an everlasting reign. It will be a just and righteous reign. He will bring righteousness to his people. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. And there we see that the wise men seek out and find Jesus so that they can worship him. Believe it or not, many scholars even would debate whether this event really happened, but as we believe the Bible is from God, we believe that these things really did take place. Some of you here may not be convinced that what we're going to read this morning is truth. Still glad you're here. Still glad you can observe and hear and be part of what we're doing this morning. I just encourage you to consider what you hear. It's very interesting. It's to learn that in this passage there are some that know the promised king, whom they call Messiah or the Christ, is to be born in a place called Bethlehem. They know the prophecy, but they don't believe it. For all intents and purposes, what they know, which they say in verse 6, is tradition. These words matter to them, but not for the right reasons, not because they're ready for God to keep his word, his promise. Others in this passage respond very differently to the news that the king has been born. So I'm going to read the passage, and as I read it, I encourage you to watch. There's three main reactions that takes place to the birth of Jesus in these verses. Watch and see how people respond differently to Jesus being born. Matthew 2, verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophets, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So did you catch the three responses? Who were those people that responded? Well, there were the wise men, and there's Herod, and then there's the Jewish chief priests and scribes, the religious leaders. We're going to look at those three responses just in reverse order. So we're going to start with the Israelite leaders. And as we look at them, we're going to see how they respond passively. They respond passively. This passive response is really shocking if you think about it. I mean, see how the events unfold. Who is it that's most aware of the birth of Jesus at this time? It's not the Jews, it's not the current king, it's Herod, it's the wise men from far away. In the Jewish terminology of that day, it's the Gentiles who are seeking Jesus. We're going to get to the wise men, we're going to get to Herod, but I want to start with these Israelite leaders. What specifically should we notice about them? Well, I point out that they know the truth. Herod asked them a very specific question. Where is the Christ to be born? And they know the answer. He's to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. Judea is the Greek term for Judah. And they know the answer because they know the prophecy. For from you shall come a ruler. Micah 5:2 says, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be known, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth is from of old, from ancient days. The end of verse 6 probably comes from 2 Samuel 5:2 or Micah 5:4, as these leaders recognize that Christ will shepherd, lead the Israelites. So it's a combination of passages. The chief priests and the scribes know the teaching from the Old Testament. They know that this little place called Bethlehem, the house of bread, is where the king will be born. But the text shows them merely to be the people supplying the right prophecy. They don't show alarm. They don't show preparation for worship. They show no care in the world about what Herod has to ask them. Is it possible for people to sing theologically rich songs today that point so clearly to the truth of Jesus Christ, but have no heartbeat for God? Yes. It's sad, but it's true. How can we say this? Well, this kind of thing's been happening for a long time throughout history. People like these chief priests and scribes have known the truth, but that truth has not affected their hearts. What do I mean by that? Well, they see no compelling reason for that truth, which they know, to affect their lives, their behavior, their worship. The Jews play only a small, disappointing role here in these 12 verses. They know the prophecies, but they don't search for the king. They don't prepare sacrificial gifts for the king. They don't go to worship the king. They simply pass on the prophecy and they fade back into irrelevance. The leaders of God's people are not ready to welcome their king. They are preeminently passive. The truth has not affected their hearts. They don't have the faith which helps them to see what's really happening. They're blind, and as a result, they're not the ones who go to worship Jesus. Now, there's something odd about the way that Matthew talks about the leadership of the Jews. He mentions the chief priests, plural, but if we were to look back in the Old Testament, there was only supposed to be one chief priest at a time. As things happened, it seemed that Herod liked to have quite a bit of control. And he would appoint and take away, remove the office of chief priest from men as he so chose. So it was entirely possible that the current chief priest was one he consulted, or he did consult, but also previous men who had been chief priests were part of that group. Others also recognized that it could be other priests involved in the administration. So leading men who were serving as priests overseeing others might have been part of the group. And then if you've heard of the Sanhedrin, the 70 or so men that ruled the Jewish religious system, it could have been, when it says all the chief priests and scribes, could have been them. Scribes were those who knew the Old Testament law, that knew the oral tradition. He was asking the experts of the day where the Christ was to be born. Already pointed out, the answer is in verse 6. Bethlehem is known for little in the Old Testament, but it's still a significant place. It's a place where David had been born. But they also knew it's the place where the Christ, the anointed one, would be born. The one who will shepherd, who will care for, who will rule over his people, will be born in Bethlehem. And again, there's no sign here that the Jewish leaders have any intention whatsoever of going to look for the king. So the first category of responses to Jesus in this passage is that of being passive, knowing the truth but not doing anything with that truth, not being moved by it, not caring enough to go worship. Speaking of worship, notice the response of this group of Jews is the only one of the three in this passage that does not involve at least a claim of wanting to worship the king. The wise men, they're genuine. They want to worship. Herod, he's definitely not genuine. We're going to talk about that soon. But he claims that he wants to worship the king. The religious leaders make no such claim. It's very possible that some of you here have no intention of truly worshiping Jesus this morning. I'm not trying to accuse you. I'm just recognizing that some of you here might not have this as your goal. Maybe you doubt that the Bible is true. Maybe you're angry with God. Maybe you just don't care. But I would remind all of us that we are not the ones who determine what is true. None of us is the final judge. None of us is God. Well, every one of us is just one person of billions of people who are responsible before God for recognizing the true King, Jesus, and worshiping him who is above all worthy of worship. The Israelite leaders respond passively. Don't be a passive observer today. Hear the truth. Believe in Jesus and worship the true King. Secondly, let's look at how King Herod responds. We can say that he responds by plotting. Now, King Herod, if you like interesting historical studies, he would be an interesting historical study. A very gifted politician. Not a pleasant man, but he was very gifted in the political realm. He ruled Judea as king from 37 to 4 BC. BC, the years go down, so from 37 to 4. In his lengthy reign, he was underneath the umbrella of the Romans. So you could call him a vassal king. He was accountable to them. But he certainly had power. He showed a lot of loyalty to the Romans, and they rewarded him for that. He was shrewd, politically savvy, and at times ruthless. Shortly after he gained power in Jerusalem, he had 45 leaders of an opposing faction executed, killed. And when it was expedient later in his reign, he was known to execute others as well, even including members of his own household, even his own wife, Miriam. He had executed. King Herod was also an aggressive builder. He was involved in rebuilding and enlarging of the temple, the construction of cities, several of his own palaces. In addition to being gifted politically, being an aggressive builder, he was not a nice man, as I said, especially towards the end of his life. His actions in our passage in Matthew are some of the final actions of his life, as he didn't live much longer. And although he was very politically powerful at this time, his family was an absolute mess, and his paranoia was growing. So there's a reason in verse 3, as it shows us how all Jerusalem was troubled when King Herod was troubled. There's a reason for that. This powerful man, and this, by this time, unstable man, could bring much disaster. One commentator said, when Herod the Great trembled, the whole city shook. Maybe the wise men knew some of these things about Herod, but maybe they didn't. It really appears that they did not understand this man who approached asking where the king of the Jews had been born. They didn't didn't realize that Herod would react with murderous intent. It's interesting and sad, though, that even as he claimed to be a follower of Judaism, he doesn't even know where the king is to be born. This is a prophecy in the Old Testament. If he was a sincere follower, he should know this. He doesn't. So we can expect that the religious leaders probably understood rather quickly that this was not a good situation, but they answer with the truth. Their lives could be on the line. They don't want to be in his target. But the talk that Herod has with the wise men in verse 7 is not a public meeting, as we might assume happened in verses 1 and 2. This second meeting Herod arranges secretly. He needs more specifics and asks when the star that the wise men followed had first appeared. He, of course, is trying to be diligent and determine the age of this child. He then sends the wise men on their mission, supposedly wanting to worship the king once they find him. Let them go and do the work. The wise men did not report back once they find Jesus, but we'll get to that part in just a bit. When we focus in on the reason for Herod's desire to find Jesus, the insecure king claims to want to worship. It's interesting that Matthew uses this language for several people who approach Jesus in the gospel for worship. But as I look, the only time that somebody was insincere in this was Herod here in this passage. How do we know that he was not sincere when he said he wanted to worship the king? Well, verse 12 shows that God makes sure the wise men are warned not to return to Herod. God wouldn't have done that if Herod was sincere in his desire to worship. But even more to the point, down in verse 16, it's very clear that Herod does not want to worship this young king. Verse 16 says, Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or younger, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. This ruthless, murderous man claims that he wants to worship Jesus. His actions show differently. This brings us to the second of three responses to the true king, and that is the response of plotting. What do I mean by that? Well, some really don't care about Jesus. They're like the religious leaders, they're passive. Others try to use him for their own good, or even worse, they see Jesus as the enemy and make plans to eliminate him. Do we have any like this today that would respond like this to Jesus? Well, of course. The one difficult thing, though, is discerning where this takes place. As people try to supplant Jesus, what's their motivation? That's hard to find. I have no desire to stir up conspiracy theories about the media, entertainment, and so on. I'd encourage you, though, to look at what people and organizations are actually doing this time of year. See, Jesus earns people a lot of money during the Christmas season. So that's crass to say about that. People use this time of the year, tradition, Santa Claus, everything around that, but also Jesus, for their benefit. I'm not saying don't celebrate Christmas. I'm not crying out that Santa is evil. I'm just trying to help us be aware that Jesus becomes a commodity to many. Sometimes this seems harmless. Recently I saw a car commercial, and I realized that the music they were playing, and actually they were saying in the commercial, was repeatedly, joy to the world. Well, why is there joy to the world? According to the car commercial, it's because they're introducing their lineup of cars that you're supposed to buy. It's not joy to the world, the king has come. It's joy to the world, cars are here and you should buy them. Now, are they being intentionally like, well, we don't want people to think about Jesus as king, we want people to think about cars as king? Well, I don't think so. They're just saying this is a traditional song during this time of year. We want people to be excited about buying cars, go get a present for whoever. Joy to the world. So maybe that's an example of harmless but still replacing. But let's be sure to understand that many want nothing to do with those who would claim Jesus is the true king, who alone is worthy of their worship. For King Herod, his rule as king was more important than the life of the one who will little child, whom some claimed was the king. Even worse, his rule was more important to him than the little boys 2 years younger, whom he had murdered, so that he could keep his throne. I'd just alert you to the fact that some plot, they plan how to use Jesus and the truth about him. Satan has many different strategies for opposing the message of salvation in Christ alone. And I call and urge us to use discernment throughout this time of the year. Beware of the subtle messages and what they can do to you and those around you. If I asked you whether people believe that Santa Claus is omnipresent and omniscient, whether he's everywhere and knows everything, you'd probably laugh that off. But is there not a song that has lyrics that say, he sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake, he knows when you've been bad or good? You say, come on, that's just harmless, that's just part of tradition. Tradition can be dangerous too. So please, just use caution. We will also be listening to Christmas songs as we have been. Just be aware as you go through this time. Beware of using God's name foolishly as you sing Christmas songs. Don't fall into the trap of making Christmas celebration all about you. Traditions can be fun, they can be wonderful. They can also make your heart hard until it really matters. So much that you start plotting, perhaps even without knowing it, and you end up with a hard heart that has no intention of worshiping Jesus Christ as Lord. Israelite leaders respond to the birth of the king passively. King Herod responds to the birth of the king by plotting, but the gentle wise men respond by worshiping. They respond by worshiping. Tradition has definitely developed around the wise men. The song, We Three Kings, shows the conclusion many have drawn that there were three kings. Although the Bible does not identify how many actually visited Jesus, nor does it identify these men as kings. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the song is evil. Just want to point out, a lot of tradition has grown up around these men. Do you know the names that some have given them by the end of the 6th century, which is several hundred years later? Tradition identified these men as Melchior or Melchior, Balthazar, and Gaspar. That doesn't mean that tradition is wrong or right, it's just people came to call these men those names. In the Eastern Church, the tradition came to be that it was not a group of 3, but of 12. Just doesn't have the same rhyme. We 12 kings doesn't sound right. Matthew doesn't give us much to go on, and we must settle with knowing very little about these men. Now, the term wise men could include a broad variety of people. By no means did all of them believe in the one true God, although, as we see here, that's possible. They could have been from Arabia, Chaldea, or Media Persia, some other place. But as you can tell from the text, they're men who watched the stars. But even that doesn't tell us a whole lot. Was the star a comet? What did it look like? How did it stand out? We just don't know those things. And really, why don't we have those details? Well, those details, to Matthew, to God, ultimately, just don't matter as much. And if those details don't matter, then what does matter about these kings, about these wise men? Or I go calling them kings without having proof. Well, here's your opportunity to look at the text. What do we see about these men? What does Matthew identify about them? Well, these men stick out for one very big reason. They're not from the area. They're outsiders. How can we tell that? Well, they don't know what King Herod is really like, for one. If they did, I don't think they would have talked to him. But secondly, they're outsiders because it appears they don't know the prophecy about where the king is to be born. If they did, we could assume that they would have gone straight to Bethlehem. That town is only about 5 miles from Jerusalem. Okay, so they weren't from the area. Why would that be important? Well, who is it that they are seeking once again? Verse 2 shows, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? People are responding to the birth of the king. But it isn't the Jewish leaders who are going to worship him. It isn't the current king of Judea who wants to worship this king. It's outsiders, Gentiles, men from other nations who come to bow before this young king. They are the ones who are ready to acknowledge the true king. As a side note, and an important side note, there's much debate over whether Jesus is currently ruling as king or not. I don't pretend to think that this passage solves everything, but notice that verse 2 does not say they're seeking the one who will become king. It says they are seeking the one who has been born king. Jesus is the true king of the Jews. He will be king of the whole earth, but he was born the king of the Jews. He's the legitimate descendant of David who will rule his people. But back on track here, here we see that already before Jesus had even grown, others from a foreign nation are coming to worship him. And in verse 10, the wise men find the star once again. Matthew clearly shows that when they see the star again, they are absolutely thrilled. The text says they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. The quest had taken them far from home. They longed for the opportunity to see the king. How they understood what the star meant, how much this trip cost them, what all they went through to get to this point, we just don't know. But perhaps their joy shows a glimpse of what this meant to them. They had been waiting for this opportunity. Then we see that they brought the gifts with them for this child. Gifts fit for a king: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, some have tried to go into those different gifts and show the meaning for those, and they might have a point there. But I think the overall message is that this is a king. This is the king who will draw from other nations those who desire to worship him. They're expensive gifts, and they show Jesus great honor as they fall before him in worship. You could choose various ways of responding to Jesus this morning. But I don't think I'm going too far to say that how you respond to Jesus shows what you think of him. These men left what they were doing in their homeland. They traveled far, brought with them costly gifts, all to worship Jesus the King. We're well acquainted with costly gifts these days. I'm not sure that we're ready to make Jesus the focus of that sacrifice, though. That's a whole other step. To say it differently, we know how to spend money on many things. We know how to spend money and time and focus, effort on many things. We know how to worship many things. But if you were to conclude that these three, if you were to conclude what they worshipped, the Jewish leaders, King Herod, and the wise men, if you were to conclude what they worshipped based on these 12 verses, what would you say? The Jewish leaders don't seem to care one way or another, as some might believe that the king has been born. So it's hard to know what they worship. Herod cares for his own throne. That's what he treasures. The wise men care about finding and worshiping the king. Maybe you claim that you also are here to worship the king, Jesus. What do your actions show? Do they show your life is formed around worshiping Jesus? Your energy, your focus, your heart's desire, even your money. We'll spend all kinds of time, all kinds of money, all kinds of focus on ourselves and on those close to us this Christmas. But what do your December habits show about your view of Jesus? At this point, I'll highlight briefly 3 truths for you to consider in light of this passage. First, from the beginning of his life, Jesus was worthy of worship. This truth should be obvious from the text, but more than this, I've tried over the last 2 weeks and then again this morning to remind us, to bring us back to the teaching of Scripture, that Jesus is not simply a cute baby lying in a manger. He's the future king of the earth. This passage helps us by showing that for the very beginning of his earthly life, he was worthy of worship. We don't have the Christmas story simply so that we can enjoy the tradition of Christmas. But a manger scene, I've plays with the young Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus. We have these words to show us more of the true king, the one who is worthy of worship. We are always in a worship battle. Whether you like what I said about Christmas tradition and being cautious of motivations and things that pull you away from Jesus or not, at least admit that we are always in a worship battle. Things and people, entities are always vying for your worship. And during this time, beware of thinking too little of Jesus, Take real steps, meaningful steps, to show to God and to others that you truly treasure Jesus the King. Secondly, notice here illustrated for us that no one can manipulate a situation out of God's control. It's not possible. King Herod was a powerful man, but God was not about to let him kill Jesus. Herod would still go on to murder many people, but he would not throw off God's plan. Jesus was to grow, he was to travel around teaching and healing many, and he was to eventually die, but all that would happen God's way. God's way did not include Herod finding and killing Jesus, so it did not happen. So I challenge you to see here, as so many passages of Scripture show, that it is God who is truly in control. And then third, notice that Jesus will be worshipped as is right. This event is a tiding of what will come. You can turn to Luke 2 to see how Jesus was worshipped after he was born. This passage in Matthew 2 happens a little bit after that. We're not sure how much later. The age of the boys that Herod had killed gives us some indication. Sometimes it can be very surprising to find out who is ready to worship Jesus. In Matthew 2, it isn't the Jewish leader, it isn't the king of Judea, it's the wise man from a foreign land. Who is it today? God sees into your hearts. He knows which of you here has no intention of worshiping Jesus. He knows which of you want to, but often choose not to. He knows who here truly treasures Jesus Christ as Lord. He will be worshipped by every tribe and tongue and people and nation. He will be worshipped. I encourage you today to be one of those who falls down, so to speak, and worships this Jesus who is King. Then as you leave here, continue thinking, what should my worship of this King, Jesus, look like today? How do I show that I treasure him above all others?